Welcome to Ask Mike About Racism. So, my friend from high school, Amy, asks me a whopper of a question. It's a great question. It's going to take a long time. A few minutes. Amy asks, for you, Mike, I'm interested in knowing what stuff you think we should have been reading in school to help us all be better anti racists. Amy, this is really a great question, and I'm not going to provide a reading list, but rather I'll cover historical facts that I think are omitted and should be included in education. Our public education omitted many important facts about the United States history. We discussed Manifest Destiny, for example, in 8th grade, but I don't remember ever learning that the whole notion of Manifest Destiny was inherently racist. What we focused on was how brave white settlers picked up and moved west, opening the West for expansion of the country. They didn't know what they would encounter. What we didn't learn was the fact that in moving west, they broke the law. They invaded sovereign Indian nations. The U.S. government legally guaranteed all of that land to various indigenous tribes when it signed numerous treaties, which were needed so the government could focus on the Civil War or the second attempted invasion of Britain. In fact, the U.S. government broke literally every single treaty that it ever signed with any indigenous tribe, ever. We are founded on values of white supremacy as a country, and dishonesty to anyone who isn't white. It was so egregious, in fact, that our very own Supreme Court ruled against the government's illegal seizure of the Black Hills in the 1980s. While we learned about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the subject was presented as if he had somehow ended racism in America right before being killed. Racism was usually talked about like it was something from our past, which was confined to bad and or ignorant people, and that it ended in the 1960s. We didn't learn that gun control was primarily aimed at minorities so that they could not defend themselves against racial terrorists. We did not learn that after an attempted bombing of Martin Luther King Jr.'s house, he applied for a concealed carry permit, which was denied by the local sheriff. We learned that the first Thanksgiving in 1621 had Pilgrims and Wampanoag sharing a meal to give thanks because the Wampanoag had saved the Pilgrims from almost certain starvation. But we did not learn that many of those same Pilgrims took up arms and slaughtered many of those same Wampanoag only a few years later, because the Wampanoag had retaliated against the colonists for having broken their agreements and stealing Wampanoag lands. We did not learn that in 1637, only 16 years after that first Thanksgiving, Massachusetts Governor John Winthrop declared a day of Thanksgiving to celebrate the colonial soldiers who had slaughtered 700 Pequot men, women, and children in what is now Mystic, Connecticut. We did not learn that Christopher Columbus literally caused the complete extermination of the indigenous population on Hispaniola, or that the first thing he did was to enslave those indigenous people. We did not learn that Columbus allowed his officers to force the indigenous women and children, many as young as 8 years old, into sexual slavery. They were forced to work at Spanish brothels and please the Spanish conquistadors' sexual urges. We did not learn how indigenous women, after giving birth to children conceived by rape, would suffocate their newborn babies and then commit suicide because they couldn't imagine rearing any child in the living hell that Columbus had created. We did not learn how Columbus not only allowed but oversaw this brutality and torture as it was inflicted on people who Columbus himself described as follows. They are artless and generous with what they have, to such a degree as no one would believe but him who had seen it. Of anything they have, it can be asked for. They never say no, but do rather invite the person to accept it, and show as much lovingness as though they would give their hearts. Students need to know the true history of racism in the Americas. the fact that white supremacy was literally part of the Constitution since its inception. It should be taught that the Founding Fathers already knew slavery was wrong, and they chose to create a nation that included slavery anyway. Students should know that black people were literally included in law as being 3/5 of a human being. This was for purposes of taxation and representation. Black people, however, were not considered 3/5 of a person in terms of having any rights, including the right to life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness. Students should know that during World War II, the U.S. government took an active role in what is now called de facto segregation. We teach the lie that modern segregation in housing is a phenomenon that came to be by accident, as the result of choices made by private citizens rather than policies by the U.S. government. In fact, during World War II, black workers were recruited by the U.S. government to work in factories and naval yards that supported the war effort. There was a severe housing shortage, so the government built segregated projects with the intention that white people might stay after the war and black people would go back to wherever they came from. A few years later, when the Federal Housing Administration decided to fund a suburban single-family home developments, they specifically wrote into contracts and deeds that any house they funded could not be sold to any black American. Within a few years, companies that had been located in cities moved to the suburbs, leaving economic devastation behind. Minority citizens were prevented by law from moving to the suburbs where their jobs had moved, so they slipped into poverty. So while African Americans lost jobs and were prevented from moving into places with job opportunities, white Americans purchased homes at incredibly low prices, and within a few years their property values rose. In this way, U.S. tax dollars literally enriched average white Americans at the expense of brown Americans right through the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Even then, redlining was allowed, and it continued well into the 1980s. Students should know that in 2016, the USA elected a man to be president who has a recorded and demonstrable history of discriminatory, racist rental practices. He has settled numerous legal challenges on these counts. I can't create a reading list for schools because in many cases these books haven't been written for middle schoolers or elementary school children. I suspect that junior and senior year high schoolers could really benefit from the following list, however: An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, The Other Slavery, The New Jim Crow, How to Be Anti-Racist, Feminism is for Everybody. Thanks for a great question, Amy.